it kind of feels like there's a vision of what electric vehicles and other infrastructure solutions might look like in, say, 50 years. But how do we get there? You're, of course, at the forefront of it. I want to start by perhaps explaining to our audience what exactly you do, because you make buses, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Walk us through it.
Hi, Kriti. Well, look, thanks for having us. NFI is a business founded back in 1930, and its mission was to make primarily public transit vehicles. And then over the years, we diversified into motor coaches and different types of vehicles. As you could imagine, in a 90-year history, the evolution of the propulsion systems has continued to change. Originally from gasoline-type engines through diesel, then we got into natural gas, hybrid engines. And for a number of years, been working on different types of electric buses. So whether it be overhead trolley that you'd see in San Francisco or Seattle, or battery electric buses, and now fuel cell battery electric buses. And so in our world, a perfect environment for electrification. You know where the bus is going, you know the temperature, you know the topography, and generally you know the capacity. And so we are really excited about kind of leading the evolution to zero emission technology and propulsion across transportation.
So status update, how's it going?
Well, it's good. And of course, what's happened is lots of customers have tried and demoed and piloted electric vehicles. I mean, our company has been making electric trolleys since 1969. And then the challenge was not just to work on wire, but how do you get those buses to work off wire? Hybrid electric was a pretty significant movement, because you have a diesel engine and then hybrid electric over the last 15 or 20 years. So probably, since the late 90s into 2010s and so forth, we really got serious about battery electric. And so just for context, our business has 80,000 our industry has 80,000 public transit buses on the road in North America. And there's probably about 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,000 pure electric vehicles operating in service today. Our projections, and of course in our company 2 years ago, 10% of what we delivered was battery electric. Last year it was 18%. We're headed to 20-something this year. And we think, given the funding and the infrastructure drive, as well as the environmental perspective, by 2025, we're going to be half of what we build will be some version of electric vehicle. So it's been a long time coming, but now the slope of the curve is pretty steep.
So walk us through, for the part of our audience that perhaps isn't as familiar with the ins and outs of battery vehicles, is that and correct me if I'm wrong here, Paul, but basically the incentive to have a kind of a battery vehicle as opposed to charging stations throughout the country is simply a matter of convenience and also a matter of cost. Walk us through the specifics of that trade-off.
So the easiest part of the system is the vehicle, not to be disrespectful of the technical challenges and the work our team's done, but getting the bus to have sufficient batteries depending on its route structure and so forth is one thing. The bigger issue for our transit agency is how do they convert? So they've got a fleet, pick a good-sized city with 500 diesel buses or 500 natural gas buses, now moving to battery electric over time. So you not only have it's the same basically envelope of a bus, but you got a different propulsion system, which means you need different skill sets. Then you have to charge these things, which means you need a source of energy as well as a charging infrastructure. So when there's 10, 15 buses in a depot, that's kind of easy. We can put it in the corner, we can get electricity. As those transit agencies start to get a material size of their fleet, now you're juggling, two horses at the same time, or two balls. You got the electric fleet that you're trying to support, as well as a diesel fleet. You're trying to wean off of the old fleet from a spare parts and a maintenance perspective. It's a pretty sophisticated change. The other dynamic is when battery electrics first started a couple of years ago, we saw originally a vision of very, very small battery packs on a bus, but charging stations throughout the route. And while that sounds eloquent, the process, the cost, the complexity, the various political dynamics around putting those all over cities is very difficult. So now the pressure is to try and have batteries, whether they're full battery or fuel cell electric. Perfect world is charge them or fuel them overnight, let them run the entire route during the day, and then do it again at night. But again, therein comes a challenge. The amount of energy you need at night for this massive fleet is quite substantial. And so we think of it more as an ecosystem as opposed to a replacement bus, because us supporting the customer needs to think about all of those elements, not just here's your new bus, put it in service.
So where do you get that electricity from? I mean, this is coming in the background of electrical grids across the United States, and I'd argue Canada as well, really struggling for that. At the same time, natural gas prices, oil prices are getting even more expensive. So how do you find a cost-effective solution to charging overnight?
Well, that answer really comes from every individual municipality or city or state in terms of how they want to approach it, or in Canada, of course, our provinces. We're blessed in Canada with a number of provinces that have renewable hydroelectricity. And so they're not worried about the source of energy. They're more worried about how do you get the energy from its source ultimately to the depots to charge the batteries. We're working with a number of different, every city, every municipality is going to be different about where they think they're going to get the energy from. In some cases, they're going to work with utilities. In some cases, they're going to put solar canopies over their bus barns. In some cases, they're going to use wind farms and so forth. In many cases, that operator has to think about that holistic ecosystem and not only putting it in today, but it's going to have to grow quite exponentially as the entire fleet transforms over the next 20 years, which then goes to our business itself, or our industry. We're no longer just selling a bus. We're working on the solution, which includes the vehicle, the charging infrastructure, partnering and assisting where we can help them think about the energy. And then there's the bigger issue, which becomes telematics and communicating with the vehicle to optimize the system. So we could find ourselves trapped in many cases with sub-optimizing a decision throughout the ecosystem, but you got to figure out the whole ecosystem. And you're absolutely right. There are some parts, let's just pick on California for a sec, that's going to have a heck of a time because the buses need the energy. The world needs the energy that's today. Then there's cars that are converting, and then the trucks and so forth. It's going to be a pretty serious demand. The great news in all of this is the federal government in Canada and the United States have stepped up and made serious commitments around funding and policy. So it's in our world, it's not a matter of if we're going to convert to clean, renewable propulsion vehicles, it's when, and it's a pace of adoption.
Well, I think that's a really crucial point that you just brought up, because, of course, sitting here in the United States, President Biden has been very vocal about it, something Prime Minister Trudeau has also shared when it comes to kind of things he's been very passionate about. But walk us through the time frame here. I mean, after all, President Biden's only in office for, I want to say, another 2 years, pending re-election if he indeed runs again. It's a similar story for Prime Minister Trudeau as well. How long do you need that support to really make a substantial difference given the political atmosphere that we're in?
Well, it's a really insightful question, because to some extent what we see now is almost a jump starting of the process. The last 5 years, people have tried a small, size of a fleet and proving concept. How does it work on my routes? What weather or topography impacts the performance of that vehicle? The Infrastructure Act had a massive jolt, if you will, with a 5-year window around helping customers think about sizable orders of zero emission and then money available to help them think through the infrastructure dynamic. I think it's a little bit, of course, I'm Canadian, but I think it's a little bit like the snowball going down the hill. It's got to start. And once it starts, there's kind of no going back. The good news is that the economics around operating an electric bus makes sense. But, if you compare it to the conventional diesel bus and then the life cycle costs over, say, 12 or 14 years, you take a more expensive electric bus and then you have less operating costs, less maintenance costs, less parts, less energy costs. Ultimately, it's about the same cost, plus or minus, to operate over that life cycle. So we don't need special subsidies once the game starts happening. We need money up front to help that momentum start to happen. And then once it goes, we're going to see battery prices come down. We're going to see reliability and range get better and better. And in our world, or even upstream in the battery world, a year or 2 years is a lifetime. So, as we see that fleet transition over, let's call it the next 20 years or 25 years, we're going to see light years change in terms of the reliability, performance, range, and all those issues. I think what's so critical, as I just said a minute ago, is today, right now, 2021, 22, the amount of money that's going in to get that game started is absolutely the right thing to do, but fundamental for us to lead that transition to zero emission.
It's a fascinating conversation when we talk about the political ramifications as well. Paul, I also love that you did a little shout out for Canada. It's okay. We won't hold it against you here in the United States that you're Canadian. Well, I want to give you a little bit of a rapid fire round for the benefit of our audience here to just talk about the specifications of the bus itself or the buses that you are offering. How long does it take to actually make one?
Well, the making of the bus, Kriti, can be, 4-6 weeks. The making of it is really, really the easy part. Every city, every municipality has all kinds of different unique things about their operating environment, their political environment, special interest groups, needs. and so forth. And so getting the specification right at each of those cities is a big deal. And quite honestly, it can take 6-9 months to put an RFP together, and then 6 or 9 months for that RFP to go through its evaluation process, various bidders and so forth. And so kind of what happens is every city, every municipality will customize the vehicle for their local needs or desires, which makes it kind of difficult to run an operating manufacturing facility, and yet fully understand it's taxpayer dollars. That city or municipality needs what it needs for its own environment. And you know, we're quite good at that rapid non-recurrent engineering and supply chain dynamic. But making of the bus is a relatively small portion. The non-recurrent engineering, the supply chain can take months, depending on the complexity of the vehicle.
So let's say about 18 months, hypothetically, is kind of what it sounds like, start to finish. Let's talk about the cost now. How much does it cost?
Well, buses are very sophisticated vehicles. They're operating in many cases 20 something hours a day. They're operating in all kinds of weathers. They're operating on, in some cases, dedicated roadways, but in most cases, regular roadways. You got traffic dynamics, you got accidents, and all these other issues. We kind of think about an average diesel bus with a 12 to 14-year life, about $500,000. When you add a natural gas, that's maybe another $50,000. When you add a hybrid system to it, it's 150 to 200. When you get into battery electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell electric buses, we're north of $1 million. And again, depending on battery pack size and so forth. But this isn't a trivial investment for a municipality. The other issue is it's kind of like a marriage. I mean, they're making a commitment to a product that's got to last, a decade plus. And so everything around life cycle, reliability, spare parts, training, all these things is so critical in their decision criteria, because it's not like a lawnmower that a city buys for the city maintenance crews. This thing's got to last and it's got to perform for a long time.
Well, I'm really glad you emphasized that point, because we're looking here at a product that's supposed to last, I want to say 12 to 14 years, costs north of $1 million, or it certainly can, and then actually costs about 18 months of time to actually physically make, which means that your company is very exposed to supply chain issues. I want you to walk me through the dynamics of what kind of supply chain issues you're seeing on your territory here.
Well, not to get too back into the history, but it is a very unique business. Unlike, say, a truck or a tractor manufacturer where you have pre-configured options for everything going down the production line. In our environment, we have batches. So one city wants 20 and 200 over here and 5 over there and so forth. So we're buying in a very highly customized type environment. And the supply chain, is always variable at the best of times. We hit COVID, and then, of course, it was more a labor and a productivity and an open versus closed dynamic. Halfway through the waves of COVID, probably mid-20 to late 2021, we started to see massive supply chain issues. And those were compounded all the way upstream around shutdowns and isolation in the China dynamic, material content, whether it's connectors, microprocessors, and so forth, making it away across the ocean, getting into our suppliers, then coming to us. Today, anything with a microprocessor, electrical components, continues to be a very challenged environment. I'm not Ford or GM that needs to buy 10 billion of these things. I need 20 of those modules and 50 of those connectors. And so it's a very, very different dynamic. It's getting better, but it's still a very delicate, let's say, volatile type environment from an efficiency perspective to run our facilities. Back to the fact that they're highly customized, there are no two buses that are the same, which adds a fair bit of complexity. The great news is the transit agencies have been very supportive of us adjusting production schedules, and in many cases, supporting their wanting to adjust those schedules for deployment to new fleets.
So what kind of lag time does that put in? The supply chain issues that you just outlined, we talked about it being about 18 months to actually physically create this design included. What kind of lag time are you looking at as a function of these supply chain issues?
Well, some things we can solve quickly. The window frame aluminum extrusion is a problem. We try and resource it, or our manufacturing partner tries to resource it, and so forth. They can solve the problem in 2 or 3 weeks. Right. Microprocessor issues, as you know, are not simple to solve, and most of it is centered around Asian manufacture. And to my surprise, a wafer that's made in Austin, Texas, that gets shipped to China, that gets shipped to somewhere else, and back to China, back to the U.S., has got quite the lag in that stuff. Some of that stuff can be 3 or 4 months to solve the problem. Intuitively, you'd think, well, why don't you just dual source or alternate source? The batch quantity is a little bit like building a house. You and I chose a door handle or a window, and it's a little bit difficult based on unique specifications to alternate source that stuff. It's getting better. The world is starting to slow down. We're seeing massive investments in the United States around chip manufacture and battery sourcing and manufacture and so forth. Lots of light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still going to be a turbulent time for our industry, I think, for the next couple of years.
So give us a time frame here. How long till we finally hit that light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, our material availability online at the point of installation on a vehicle is in the 90s. We're getting most of the material, where a year ago it was in the 80s. So we're a much better place. Unfortunately, you can't deliver partial bus, and so we're probably 3, 4, 6 months before we start to see that those major parts that have caused us production delays a little bit more healthy. But at the same time, we're doing everything we can in terms of thinking about all dual sourcing or higher safety stocks and so forth on our production lines to be able to make sure that we can build a bus to a customer specification on time.
Which brings me, in the last few minutes that we have left, to the question of infrastructure. We talked a little bit about charging stations and why the battery vehicle is perhaps the better alternative to it, so it can charge actually at night. But even within the United States, you have some major names. Think Elon Musk is the first that comes to mind that's really vouching for that charging infrastructure, especially when it comes to more long distances. Lots of land in Canada, lots of land in the United States. Walk us through the infrastructure part of your business and the issues you're seeing there.
Well, it's kind of the silent killer, if you'll pardon the simple analogy, because you can't move that vehicle without energy. And so we got the riddle, as we talked before, about where do you get the energy from, but getting it into the vehicle is the challenge. So a transit agency, the buses go home at night. They go back to the depot or wherever they ultimately go, farms or bus barns and so forth. And so that infrastructure discussion is figuring out with the transit agency or the municipality about how we're going to put that in place to charge that fleet for that route. And whether they go battery electric, so they need electricity, or whether they go fuel cell electric and they need to bring in hydrogen or make hydrogen is one problem. The other problem that you alluded to, whether it's Tesla or any other truck manufacturer, is you got to get vehicles and even motor coaches from one part of the country to the next. And so sure, we can charge it somewhere that we're comfortable, it's our place or whatever, but we got to charge it en route. Therein lies going to be some of the delay of the adoption of zero emission over the network of the country. And I think what you're going to see in our world is the transit buses will go relatively quickly over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And we can do math and we can think about isolating areas. It's that network across the country that I think the motor coaches are going to rely heavily on the pace of adoption of the truckers. And again, whether they go battery and they charge them electricity or whether they go battery with fuel cell and have range extenders onto them. But it's scary because it's massive. It's not just tweaks, it's massive step change. And yet it's incredibly exciting to think about a completely new ecosystem, not just the vehicle, but all of the charging and the energy sourcing and so forth. So fast forward 25 years, boy, it's going to be a very different environment in terms of emissions, but also how this stuff moves. And the vast majority of vehicles in our world, buses and coaches in 25 years, are probably be converted.
Well, I'll leave you with one last question here, and please be honest. What kind of headwinds are you seeing to get to that ideal ecosystem that you just described? What could get in your way?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's one of these ones again until you start to dig into it. The source of energy is probably the biggest one, right? Because we have parts of America, parts of Canada that have limited elements or limited sources of energy, and of course, right now the price of energy is not for the faint of heart, right? So there's that whole source and cost economics that's the issue. The other thing is COVID and supply chains are the immediate headwinds, and then of course the other big issue is as you alluded earlier, is the physical charging infrastructure, whether it's a charger at a station on the side of the road or at the depot. The last one is often not talked about, but it's as real as any of them, which is people. The skill set of the planner, buyer, technician, driver is very different. Sure, the bus has got wheels and it's got a window and a steering wheel, but the skill set around buying, operating, and managing and maintaining is a big deal. And that can't be left behind. In fact, we got to get onto that earlier in the process, because back to what I said before, we got to manage the existing fleet and you got to manage this new fleet and the transition. People are going to be the critical part of making that happen.